Grace Martone.
Hi, I'm Abby Turbeville, and this is Martinville News.
Recently, 4 mass graves that concealed thousands of victims of the Rwandan genocide for 24 years have been discovered this Sunday on April 22nd.
Between 2,000 and 3,000 may be buried in the mass graves, a spokesperson with the Genocide Survivors Organization, Ibuka, told the Associated Press.
The unmarked graves are located in the Kigali province, not far from the Kigali Genocide Memorial, where some 2,500,000 victims were brought and buried.
The discovery raises concerns as Rwandans try to move past those dark days. The conflict between the Tutsi and the Hutu peoples started when the Tutsis, also known as the Watutsis, were a nomadic people who began arriving in the Great Lakes region from Ethiopia some 400 years ago, settling amongst the Hutus, adopting their language, beliefs, and customs.
But economic differences between the two groups soon began to form. The Tutsis, as cattle herders, were often in a position of economic dominance to the soil-tilling Hutus. This is not to say that all Tutsis were rich or all Hutus were poor, but in many areas like Rwanda, the minority Tutsis ruled the Hutus.
Following independence in 1962, Uganda and Burundi split into two countries, Rwanda and Burundi. In Rwanda, the Hutu majority lashed out at the minority Tutsis, killing thousands and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee to neighboring Uganda.
While in Burundi, the minority Tutsis maintained their control of the military government through a campaign of violence against the Hutus. Although they lost multi-party elections in 1993, 2 assassinations and a military coup have allowed the Tutsis to remain in power.
Generally, the Hutu-Tutsi strife stems from class warfare, with the Tutsis perceived to have greater wealth and social status.
Leading up to and during the genocide of 1994, the Hutu and Tutsi people were given identification cards to signify what group that they were a part of.
During colonization, the Belgians measured Rwandans' noses, the distance between their eyes, and various other arbitrary, random facial dimensions. Then they defined which facial features were the Hutu or Tutsi.
The Tutsis tend to be tall, thin, and they have long noses, high-pitched voices, and relatively clear skin. Hutu tend to be short, strong, and have relatively broader features. They have big noses and low-pitched voices.
Those with the wrong designation were then murdered at roadblocks, on the street, or anywhere they were asked for their ID.
The start of the killings was on April 6, 1994, when the president of Rwanda was in an airplane accident which is suspected as an assassination.
The genocide took place in the context of the Rwandan Civil War, a conflict beginning in 1990 between the Hutu-led government and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, also known as RPF, which largely consisted of Tutsi refugees whose families had fled to Uganda after the 1959 Hutu revolt against colonial rule. The mass killings in Kigali quickly spread from that city to the rest of Rwanda.
On April 7th, the Hutus started to kill their political opponents, including the Prime Minister of Rwanda. The victims of the mass murders were not only the Tutsi minority members, but also the moderate Hutu. Those members of society were killed by the Hutu extremists who thought it wasn't good enough just to be Hutu. To survive, you had to be willing to do anything for the ethnic group.
Sadly, neighbors killed neighbors, and some husbands even killed their Tutsi wives, saying that they would be killed by the extremists if they refused. At the time, ID cards had people's ethnic group on them, so militias set up roadblocks where Tutsis were slaughtered, often with machetes which most Rwandans kept around the house. Thousands of Tutsi women were taken away and kept as sex slaves.
These murders and massacres lasted until mid-July and were known as the 100 Days of Slaughter.
Immediately after the genocide ceased, within Rwanda up to 2 million people fled the country, most of them being the Hutu perpetrators.
A service called World Vision began working in Rwanda right after in 1944 and provided life-giving emergency aid and displaced people to help them resettle.
This organization cared for orphan children, had programs for peace building and reconsolidation, which laid the foundation to rebuild many lives today. Over 1 million people were potentially culpable for a role in the genocide, nearly 1/5 of the population remaining after the summer of 1994, and the RPF pursued a policy of mass arrest for the genocide, jailing over 100,000 in the 2 years after the genocide.
20 years after, barely 70 individuals out of the thousands involved had been convicted by the UN-backed court that was designed to deliver justice.
The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, pioneered the first genocide trials in Africa, but after almost 20 years of legal argument and an estimated bill of $1.7 billion, only a tiny proportion of the Rwandan malefactors has been brought to justice.
A total of 92 people, overwhelmingly Hutus, were indicted for their role in the 100-day genocide that killed 800,000.
9 suspects, including Felician Kabuga, alleged to have purchased the machetes handed out to the Hutu militias, and who was part owner of the Mille Colonnes radio station, which broadcast hate campaigns against the Tutsis, have never been located. Several suspects are thought to be hiding in eastern Congo.
The informal courts ran for about 10 years, between 2002 and 2012, during which time the government estimated that 1.9 million people appeared before locally elected judges.
Defendants were given shorter sentences in exchange for confessing and encouraged to seek forgiveness from victims' families. Some perpetrators were sentenced to hard labor. In addition, a government-led program of exhumation of mass burials and individual graves has taken place over the last decade.
The exhumation of mass graves has been undertaken, in the main, by Tutsi genocide survivors who work under the supervision of state officials.
At least 200 bodies have been exhumed from one mass grave recently, and about 150 from another.
The work takes place under the auspices of a Rwandan Patriotic Front known as RPF government body, the National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide.
Fragments of bodies, or items believed to be fragments of bodies, are painstakingly sifted from masses of substrate removed from the graves. Soil is washed away from exhumed substances, and human remains are unraveled, with personal possessions, clothes, identity cards, bones, flesh, and other soft tissues separated from one another.
The exhumations are taken under and the presumption that there are between 800,000 and 1 million bodies of Tutsi genocide victims buried within Rwanda. Many lie in mass graves, some have been interred by family plots, and a large number are assumed to be concealed in shallow burial.
Post-unearthing, these bodies are unraveled, and the remnants of soft flesh, clothing, personal possessions, and bones are separated from each other.
Skeletal structures are fully disarticulated and the bones pulled into vast collective for placement within memorials.
Therefore, the outcome of these exhumations is that remains almost always lack individual identity at the point of reentering.
The crypts within the memorials house thousands of bones, divided by rough anatomical type and stored on shelving or in collective coffins. Memorials may be open for general public viewing and are a popular destination for the tourists.
Oh God. Okay.
Hi, I'm Grace Martone. Abby!
I'm sorry, it was just so funny.
Oh!